All right, now it's time to settle our ejection issues, get us all squared away, get the casing out, get it extracted, and have a beautifully functioning firearm. What I'm going to do really quick is cover some of the terminology that you're going to hear me use in this video. I'm going to be talking about ejectors. Now, understand that this is the housing, right? This is the trigger housing, and when I'm talking about ejectors, I'm talking about this piece right here. Looks like this. I'm going to be talking about 3 different types of ejectors. I'm going to be referring to a 336 ejector, which is what comes in your OEM parts kit. I'm going to be talking about a 3274 ejector, which is mid to late Gen 4s. I'm also going to be talking about 47021 ejectors. This I'm referring to as the Gen 5 19X ejector. Okay? So those are ejectors. Then I'm going to be talking about some extractors. And when I'm talking about extractors, you're going to hear me use the word MIM when I'm talking about an OEM extractor that comes in your OEM kit. Now MIM, M-I-M, is metal injection molding. And basically what that means is they take a whole bunch of metal powder, they mix it into a feedstock, and they come out with a new piece that is infused, and it's called metal injection molding. When I'm talking about MIM, we're talking about the extractor. I'm also going to be talking about spring-loaded bearings, and I'm going to be using a term like LCI and non-LCI. When I say LCI, I'm referring to a loaded chamber indicator bearing. This is what comes in your OEM parts kit. When I say non-LCI, I mean a non-loaded chamber indicator bearing. This does not come in your OEM parts kit. I'm also going to be talking about Apex Glock failure resistant extractors. Okay, and I'm going to be talking about their springs as well. So let's start to understand ejection and how we got here and why it's such a problem here in the polymer 80 community. I'm specifically again talking about 9mm and 40 cal. That's the family I'm talking about. We're going to solve 90% of the problems right here, right up front with ejection and extractor changes from an LCI system to a non-LCI system. And then the last 10% I'm going to cover at the end for all of the other calibers to kind of diagnose, because chasing an extraction issue, most people chase symptoms, and I'm going to help you methodically get to the root cause of your problem. So, brief history in Glock. Glock comes out in the early 80s, completely revolutionizes the firearm industry. I mean, really, just makes a weapon that is just completely reliable and dependable and changes the face of what we know about the pistol market. In the late 80s, they made some changes to the aesthetics of the weapon. Again, in the mid 90s, they made some more aesthetic changes, but they never recognized it as Gen 1, 2, and 3. That was really, us in the community. Every time they made a little change, we called it a different generation. But I want you to understand that Glock never really recognized that until they came out with the Gen 4 and they actually started to change parts of the weapon, okay? And that's why they stamped the slides on Gen 4 with Gen 4. But before then, they weren't really recognizing the different generations of Glock. That was really us in the community defining it for them. So Gen 4 is really the first time that they're going to begin to actually play with parts and swapping out parts and trying different things. As we get to the end of Gen 3 and the beginning of Gen 4, Glock begins to suffer ejection issues at a very massive scale, extraction issues on a major scale. And, I want you to understand that while I'm going to be tough on Glock, I'm not talking about Glock the firearm. I am talking about Glock the corporation, and there is a difference between the two, okay? The firearm is fantastic. The corporation really doesn't take accountability. When I look at a company, I always say a company is judged by how well they perform when they run into an issue. And the reality is that when Glock first runs into this issue in late Gen 3 production, early Gen 4, they not only become unaccountable to their actions, they go a step further and blame the consumer, making it even worse. And to this day, they still have not taken accountability for what they've done. They know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what the problem is, and they refuse to take accountability for it and fix it. All right. So with that said, late Gen 3, early Gen 4, well, Gen 4 rolls out, and it rolls out to a complete nightmare for Glock. Okay, it's a disaster. I'm talking 9mm 40 cal here. Okay, 9mm 40 cal is a complete disaster for Glock when they roll it out. Users are talking about brass to the face issues. They're talking about lots of stovepiping. And Glock comes back with, well, it's you. It's the user. You're limp wristing it. It's your fault. The weapon is fine. And it's not until their law enforcement and military contracts start to complain that they start to really take notice, right? Because Glock's got an enormous percentage of their industry is tied up in law enforcement and military, and telling the law enforcement and military community that they're limp wristing it just wasn't cutting the mustard, right? So they begin to recall just law enforcement and military and resolving some of the issues around ejection. But as far as, the consumer market, it was go frig yourself, all right? They were still blaming users and weren't really taking care of the problem. It was just incredibly frustrating because we had known Glock to be so dependable, so reliable, and here they are not taking accountability, which added to the frustration. But the reality is that we had undependable weapons at that time. Okay. And, like everything else, people that had earlier models are like, no, everything's fine. Okay. But it wasn't. We start to look at, well, what did they change? Like, what did they do? Okay. And honestly, the problem actually started in the late model Gen 3s because Gen 3 was fantastic. It was fine. There was no problems with it. But one of the things that they changed in Gen 4 was the extractor with the 336 ejector. Now, the 336 ejector had always been in the Gen 3 model. So we weren't really looking at the ejector. We were looking at this new part that they put in, this new extractor they put in. It had a dip in it. It was no longer steel. It was a MIM part. And so this became, something that everybody's looking at as maybe this is the culprit. Reality is even back then, the aftermarket wasn't as big as it is today. There wasn't a whole lot of people making aftermarket extractors for you to try with, right? Because Glock was so dependable, that's what you use. Glock, from day one, has always had, weird ejection patterns, okay? Always have had that problem. But the thing is nobody really paid attention to it because it was so damn reliable. It was so damn dependable. I remember shooting my first Glock and seeing things, flick out from the extractor. Like, wow, that was weird. But you know what? Every time you pulled the trigger, the gun went bang. And so I wasn't really concerned about going to the 4 o'clock position every single time because it was such a dependable weapon. And everybody else kind of felt the same way. But when this issue started to occur, we started to look at it and say, hey, wait a minute. Not only are we having now a problem with erratic ejection in this generation, but now we're actually taking brass to the face. Right? The casing's coming back at us. The rounds that aren't hitting us, a lot of them are going over our right shoulder. What's that about? My friends, I can't even really explain to you how much turmoil was going on at that time. I mean, there was a revolt. And it was ugly. It was ugly. And Glock didn't do anybody any favors by blaming the community and blaming people. You can almost see exactly how it happened, right? You can almost look back and say what was going on at that time, and it's probably some person sitting there in the Glock Corporation with an Excel spreadsheet. They're making this new part out of MIM, right? Cost saving, MIM, right? And they say, hey, listen, Mr. and Mrs. Vice President, this will actually go in a Gen 3 Glock. So why don't we, since we're making them for Gen 4, start to save ourselves money and start shipping these out and putting them in Gen 3 Glocks, right? I mean, you can almost see that happen. The problem is that it caused, brass to the face. Then comes along Apex Tactical. Today, a lot of the new users know them as making fantastic triggers. I always look at them as the American story, right? The American story. What Apex does probably the best in my opinion, and it's not just in Glock, they do it for other firearm manufacturers. They look at the problems that users are having where the firearm manufacturer doesn't want to take accountability and fix, and they engineer the hell out of it. They fix it, and then they sell the consumer the parts that will make that firearm functional. They have built an empire out of being fantastic problem solvers, okay? And I mean, that's just what it is. They really didn't play around with Glock back then, but they knew that this issue was huge, and they started to engineer it. They started to kind of reverse engineer it. They had this fantastic study, and I mean, when I tell you that everybody in the Glock community at that time was kind of latching on to what they were doing and paying really close attention because, listen, we wanted our firearms to work. And what they produced was an extractor, a fail-resistant extractor, and a spring. But the extractor specifically, they came down and said, hey, listen, this claw, all right, so if we look at an extractor, this is the part that grabs on to the back of the casing, okay, as it comes back, all right? And so they looked at this and said, you know what? This is no good. And so Apex, let me just open this real quick. Apex comes along and they develop a extractor with a really good claw, okay? So as you can see here in their claw system, it's got this piece that sticks out that really latches on to the casing, okay? So if we're here and it's coming out, it's really got a tight grip on it, right? It's really holding it in place really well. And so, I mean, hey, listen, you know, big up to Apex, fantastic. You know, doing what they do best, which is, you know, solve problems that manufacturers don't want to solve. All right. So what does this all have to do with us today? How did this creep its way to us since this was 10 years ago? Okay. Well, you know, back then we had some fixes, we got around it, and we kind of moved on. All right. But then this very forward-thinking, progressive company called Polymer 80 comes out a couple years later, right? Ingenious idea. Build at home. You could use Glock parts. It's, again, improving completely upon the Glock design. Why? Because Glock doesn't listen to its customers. So what do? They don't only give us a beautiful build at home design, they give us the front rail, they give us the double undercut, right? They do everything that we have been screaming about for years, they give us, and we can build it ourselves. Huh, wonderful. You know how we just talked about these parts that Glock is not accountable for? What are they sending you? 336 ejector, junk mem part. What does that mean? You have to understand something here, my friends. Polymer 80 has completely revolutionized the 80% market. Polymer 80 has made Glock millions and millions of dollars in OEM kits. Because let me tell you, for sure, before Polymer 80 came along, nobody was buying these Glock Gen 3 OEM parts kits. You know why? Because we knew that these pieces were absolutely useless to us. We knew that. And here's the thing, people are ordering OEM parts kits, and this is exactly what Glock is sending them, right? This is exactly what Glock is putting in their OEM kits, knowing that there are faults with it, knowing that it's not right, and making millions of dollars selling OEM parts kits for people to put in their 80% build. Now, let's get something straight, my friends. They're loving this. They get to sell you these parts, the cheapest parts they made, the parts that don't work, and they don't need to warranty them because they're not going in their gun, right? So for them, it's a win-win-win-win-win situation. Except for us, the consumer, it's lose-lose-lose. Because when you build a 9mm or a 40 cal, especially in the compact model, you are suffering stovepipes. You are suffering from brass to the face. And Glock knows it. Doesn't care. But you know what? That's another whole issue. So now let's solve the problem for you. Let's recreate kind of what happens here with ejection, okay? So the bullet is in here, okay? The trigger is on top of the shelf. Your striker is here. You pull the trigger back, it disconnects, and bang! Bullet comes out, kills your target. Okay, so that's kind of how that works. At the same time, this recoil, that energy is coming back on your recoil spring. Okay, so let's understand it from this angle for a second. Okay, so bullet went out. Okay, casing is locked onto this claw of our extractor. It's coming back here, hits the ejector, okay, and then the extractor, holding onto it with the claw, flicks it out. All right, so that's general extraction of how it works. So a lot of things need to go right, as you can see, in order for good ejection. One of the things that needs to occur is that we got to get a good hit on the ejector, right? It's got to have a good hit. The second really major thing that has to happen is the claw of the extractor needs to have a good hold in order to flick it out properly, okay, in the direction it should be done. So now let's look at the different ejectors that we have. So this again is the 336 ejector that comes in an OEM parts kit, all right? And this is a 3274, which is a Gen 4, and right away you can start to see some differences, okay? Number one, the 3274 is a little bit thicker, which obviously means what? It's gonna hit more impact on that casing, right? Where this is just kind of comes to a point, right? Doesn't have a lot of good hit. The 3274 has a much better hit. On the right-hand side, this is the 336. This is the Gen 4 3274. So the next thing that we can look at is the curvature, okay? So the 336 curves this way, right? So if you think about it, casing's coming straight. The casing's not coming on an angle. So as it's coming, it's gonna hit, right? It's gonna hit that curve. It's trying to push it that way. The other issue with the 336 though, that is, you know, first of all, there is stovepiping, and then there is what we see here in the Polymer 80 and what we saw and when Gen 4 came out and they started using these parts in late Gen 3 is boom, vertical stovepiping. Holy hell, it's like, what the hell is that? Okay? So if we look at the 336, it's bent this way, right? It's curving that way. You look at the 3274, okay, it comes up over and then straight, all right? So it's still got a little bend, but the way they do it is to really hit it dead on, okay? It's moving it to the right to get out to the extractor, but once it comes here and hits, not only does it have a hell of a lot more, let me turn these around so you can see them. Not only does it have a hell of a lot more surface area for it to hit, it's also gonna hit it dead on, okay? Where this is gonna hit it at an angle, okay? So boom. Then we have, I'm gonna keep the 336 out for a second. Then we have the new 19X, okay? So this just came out, the Gen 5 19X. So this is a whole new way to think about ejection that didn't exist before, okay? This one says, hey, listen, we liked that curve design. We got you. We liked it. But the reality is that you needed a little more bite. You needed that thickness still, okay? And so I want you to understand that the 3274 works great, and it did solve it, but it wasn't thrusting the casing out. It was getting it out. That's the most important. But it wasn't thrusting it out, okay? And so with the 19X swap, you start to see, you know, better ejection, more forceful. I have 1,473 rounds right now using this ejector as a test with fantastic results. you know. Can I sign off on it 100%? No, I don't think I can. The 3274 I can, because I probably have, I don't know, tens of thousands of rounds over the years using that. But this design, from a geometry standpoint, makes complete sense, and it has been performing really well. So, you know, I've got no complaints on that. All right. So what do you got to do? Well, look, you've got this OEM trigger housing, and you've got this 336, okay? Now, when we look at a 3274 housing, or even the 47021, the 19X housing, they're the same. See how the housings are exactly the same? The thing is these housings don't fit into your polymer 80 frame. They're not going to fit in here. And the reality is that we don't really need the housing. All we need is the ejector itself. We need to replace. And by the way, you know, understand that these ejectors I'm talking about are $5 to $6, $7, $8 in that range. So we're not talking about a big investment to fix this ejection issue, okay? So basically what we do is this. Rather than try to, this is our 336, your OEM, rather than try to manipulate this whole trigger housing to kind of line up with your pins and all that other stuff, we're going to just sneak this ejector out, okay? We're going to take the ejector out of this one. I'm going to use a Gen 5 here for demonstration purposes. I'm going to take the ejector out of here, and I'm going to put that ejector into our Gen 3 housing. Okay, pretty good, right? So all you have to do is take a small screwdriver here, okay? You don't want to come in from the front and pull this out, although it will come out, but you don't want to bend your ejector. So in the back here, you can see it sticking out a little bit, okay? All I'm going to do is I'm going to take a small screwdriver, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start it moving out, okay? And it's just going to come straight out like that, okay? Then I'm just going to take a small punch, and I'm going to push it completely out and through, just like that. This is the 336 I just took out of your OEM Gen 3 housing, okay? And we don't need that anymore. But now we need to put our upgraded ejector in. So here's a 47021, a 19X Gen 5. Come from the back here and push that out, just like that. Take my small punch and push it out the rest of the way, just like that, okay? So I don't need the other housing, so I'm going to put that aside. Now we're going to take our original trigger housing for our Gen 3, and I'm going to place this new ejector into the housing from the front, like this. I'm just going to put it in, and I'm going to start to slide it back in, nice and easy, okay? Now, when it comes to these ejectors, you need to make sure that they become very flush with the housing. A mistake that is often made with ejectors is that you don't get completely flush. I come in long ways with the screwdriver, and I make sure that it fully seats up against that trigger housing. So that's how we do a swap. Now look, we got a perfect, beautiful new ejector in our trigger housing, and it's ready to go, okay? So that's gonna solve most of your ejection issues. It's certainly gonna help solve your stovepiping issue. If you have a stovepiping issue, that, my friends, is now gone. So now we've solved the ejection portion of it. We're gonna get the casing out of the gun. Right? That's the most important, because we want the casing out of the gun. The next piece, though, is, well, where does that casing go? Extraction, right? And so while this fixes the stovepiping issue, we're now still prone to getting brass to the face and that casing, hot brass, hitting us. And we don't want that either, okay? So now we need to tackle the extractor piece of it. And as I said earlier, Apex has delivered us a fantastic solution. The piece with Apex, though, is Apex uses a non-LCI system, right? So there's that word again, loaded chamber indicator. The spring that you get in your OEM kit, so let's look at it this right here, on our plunger, you have a spring and you have an LCI bearing, a loaded chamber indicator bearing. That works with their MIM extractor, okay? So we're going to change the extractor, and you can tell that this is flat, right? You see the apex is flat compared to the MIM, which is beveled in, right? Okay? But the apex uses a non-loaded chamber indicator, and that is this right here. That is this bearing right here. Now, just by looking at it, I'm just going to put it in the spring for a second. So one of the things that you can see right away is that a non-LCI is much bigger than an LCI, okay? You know, these little plungers, by the way, these non-LCIs, they don't come in the Apex kit. You got to get them separate, but they're $1.50, okay? You buy them all day long, all right? But you're going to need a non-LCI bearing to go onto your spring that Apex gives you and onto your plunger. Extractor, non-LCI, non-loaded chamber indicator, fail-resistant, Apex product, genius, non-LCI bearing, and spring on your plunger. And you, my friends, are not going to have brass to the face anymore. It's that simple. It's that simple. So this clears up the ejection issue, again, 9mm 40 cal, completely. You're now going to get the round out because you've got a better ejector in your housing, and the direction of it is going to be out and to the right. I will say this, you know, I know I've been touting Apex here. This is kind of expensive, okay? This little kit here is $50, all right? And then, you know, you need to spend another $1.50, on the bearing, okay? And people are like, how can you charge $50 for, you know, an extractor and a spring? You know, that's crazy. Listen, they spent the time and the money doing the research and the engineering and the geometry around fixing that problem. And so, you know what? They should get paid for it. Good for them. I don't complain about that at all when somebody does quality work. All right. So again, expect to pay anywhere from $5 to $10 for the ejector, $1.50 for this. So you're like, you know, $12 or so, and somewhere in the $50 range for this kit. And actually, they sell, I think, an expanded kit even with their great safety plunger and their trigger, and maybe you can get it all together for a deal, okay? So before we tidy up this here, I want you to understand how the aftermarket plays into it. We are very, very fortunate, my friends. We live in a time of abundance, and I'm going to give a big shout out to Polymer 80 here, because, you know, you didn't just create a fantastic forward-thinking product. What you did was you created an entire industry, right? I mean, when we see the amount of people now, the amount of talent every day that's coming into our community between machinists and everybody else creating wonderful parts, companies coming in that are creating fantastic slides for us, they're creating fantastic barrels for us, and they get to live the American dream too. They love firearms, they love to be machinists, and because this 80% market is so big nowadays, they get to come in and do the work that they love every day. I mean, it's a fantastic thing. And with that, though, I want you to understand some things about the aftermarket, some of the issues that I observe that have bothered me, to be quite honest with you. One of the things about Polymer 80 here is that they get blamed for the ejection issue all the time. I read threads all the time. They're like, hey, I put my PF 940 together. I went out shooting. The shit stovepiped on me. It's junk. I threw it in the garbage. And it's like, dude, that had nothing to do with Polymer 80. It's directly related to bad OEM parts. You change the OEM parts. You change the direction. And again, you put these OEM parts in a Glock OEM Gen 3 frame, same problem, same issue. Okay, so I want you to understand that Polymer 80 took and continues to take a really bad rap for that. But outside of them, so does the aftermarket. We've got these great people out there creating machinists that are creating these fantastic slides and barrels and great springs and, you know, great firing pins or whatever. And they say, hey, okay, well, why don't we sell, this is what we specialize in, right? We specialize in this stuff, right? The metal. But why don't we create a package so that it's kind of one-stop shopping for the consumer, right? And again, we love that. I want to be able to buy my entire upper parts kit, and I want to buy my slide, my fancy slide that's been window cut and looks beautiful, and I want to buy it. And hey, if it comes with the upper parts kit, as a consumer, I love that. And so look, these aftermarket companies, that's what they try to do. They try to service their consumer as best as possible, right? So they create the slide and they say, hey, your slide comes with a parts kit. Now, they're not making every piece of that parts kit, right? They're making the metal pieces, their star components, and then they're going ahead and ordering and getting in mass production the OEM parts. Got it? And then so I can't tell you how many times I see that. I see an aftermarket company, which I know makes a really solid product, but has put their product and mixed it with OEM parts. And the user goes and puts that product together with those OEM parts, specifically the extractor, okay? And they get frustrated and think that it's the company, and it has nothing to do with them. And understand that I'm talking to you now, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, how does the firearms aftermarket company not know this, Marine Gun Builder? It doesn't make sense. Well, listen, you have to understand that I'm old, right? This stuff happened 10 years ago. All right. And so that 25-year-old entrepreneur right now that's coming in and doing some great machine work, they were 15 when this issue was happening. Realistically, they just probably don't know about it. They weren't aware of it. Or it could be somebody who was creating stuff that wasn't Glock related, but this industry, this 80% industry blew up and they've transitioned over to Glock. But, you can't go up the expectation that they know about it, because unless they were involved with Glock for 10 plus years, religiously, by the way, they weren't just a passive user, it's quite likely they don't know about this stuff. Again, I just want to kind of bring that up because I see that. And by the way, if you are an aftermarket company and you're watching this video, I would, maybe just a piece of advice here. If you want to take it from Marine Gun Builder, that's cool. If you're not using an OEM MIM extractor, you need to market that. I think that's in your favor, right? I think it's in your favor to talk about that. It'll also help educate our community, okay? But you can see I never use MIM extractors in my guns, right? I mean, I'm not going to use this beveled piece. I'm only using the solid piece. And by the way, let me actually talk about one more thing, which is this. You want to talk about a disappointment, right? Again, I refer to MIM as cost-saving junk. All right, and people give me heat about that all the time, and they're like, "Oh, you're too hard on them," and this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. The reality is that when MIM is done correctly, it is good and it's durable. But when you use MIM, you have too many layers of quality control issues that can come up. And so when you start to see the same problem over and over and over again, and it's always a MIM part, realistically, as the manufacturer, you've got to know that you have a quality control issue. This MIM extractor might save Glock some money in the long run, but it's really at what cost? Because their all steel extractor is $17 retail. So really, how much money are you saving here to put this at risk, to put your company at risk? It just doesn't, and then worse, blame the user. It just doesn't seem like it makes sense to me, but who am I, right? I'm just a guy trying to help you. And so look, one of your other options, again, I understand that this is 50 and this is 17, okay? But this may not solve all your problems. I'm just saying that, okay? It does, and it has for me in specific types of rounds that I use. This works extremely well, okay? But either way, it's light years ahead of what they switched to. All right, so now that takes care of our 9mm 40 cal family. Let's kind of talk about other ejection issues that happen and how we go about diagnosing and getting to the root cause of that issue. All right, so let's now get into the nitty-gritty of all our other calibers and trying to diagnose methodically and logically what our ejection issue is. And what we have to understand here first is that we can't always apply Glock logic, okay? okay? Because the reality is that this is a completely different weapon system, okay? It uses a different locking block and rail system. It uses a different pin system. It's a different polymer. It's a different overall dimension, and it's a different weight. And so therefore, we have to start to apply polymer 80 logic to what we're doing. Now, with that said, I want you to also understand here is that almost everybody, right? I mean, at least 90 some odd % of the polymer 80s we see are using aftermarket slides, custom cut slides. Some things are with windows. Some have RMRs, right? I mean, so many different types of slides. Some are taking machined off the front, machined off the back, front serrations, back serrations. I mean, the amount of outstanding slide work that out there is, it's amazing. So the first thing that we have to do in diagnosing is check our build quality, okay? And specifically, we want to look at our number one culprit, which is usually the channel, okay? And there's three things that we need to check with the channel. Number one, is it smooth enough, right? Do we have that first time quality look? Now, again, if you have scratches in here, this is something you're going to have to smooth out, okay? You're going to have to take a piece of sandpaper, and you know what works really well is if you take the sandpaper and the milling bit that Polymer 80 gives you and you wrap it up into the sandpaper, that works perfect in here and acts as, your RSA coming back and forth. It's a beautiful way, because, it can get kind of tough if you got big hands or stuff to get in there and sand. It's a beautiful method to go ahead and get it, that all smoothed out. Now, you always want to do that wet, obviously, because we're dealing with the polymer, okay? But then the next thing is, are we wide enough? And are we deep enough? Okay. Now, when you watch my channel videos, or, if you're a member of the Polymer 80 Master Builders group on Facebook, which, by the way, there's a nice plug, you should be. I'll leave a link in the description. You'll see whenever I do my live builds, I always put the front locking block in at the end when I'm trimming the sides. Why? Because I want a nice guide to make sure I'm wide enough. There's nothing like I go ahead and do my work, I go to assemble and then realize, hey, I got to take everything out and then widen it more and do all that. So a good practice is when you get to the end of this channel, to completing it, put in your front locking block and go ahead and do all your little fine trimming with that in there. Okay? But the question is are we wide enough, right? Are we wide enough to get our recoil spring in and out of there, right? That's always the question. Okay? How wide do we need to be? All right, so it's very simple how we understand or see if we're wide enough. Now, I'm doing a whole video for you folks on exactly how to check every portion of your build, okay? But basically, this is what I do. I get my digital calipers out, okay? And if we take a regular OEM spring here and we put it in, we know that an OEM spring runs basically, between 10.5 and 11, okay? I see them sometimes at like 10.58, okay? Let me just get it here, because the coils stretches out a little bit. So 10.72 is what this one is. Which means what? Which means I need to be at least that wide where? In my channel, okay? And so if I take my calipers here and I come here, I am that wide. See that? See how that works? So I'm good. Typically between the two rails, you're anywhere between 11 and 12, okay? Which, yep, we're right there. These calipers are fantastic, by the way. If you're going to do any type of gunsmithing, I recommend them upside down and backwards. Tools are in the description. They're only about $12, but they make, measuring every piece of your build, not only here, but when, I do ARs and every other type of build, they come in so handy to check dimensions, okay? And so, okay, so we're wide enough, we're deep enough, we're smooth enough. Hey, that's the channel. That's the number one thing that gets users, especially new users, right? Because they're always trying to get down there. Basically, if you don't have calipers, you want to be able to look down through the front locking block, through the channel, and you should not see any polymer on either side. And then straight down the channel should be as smooth and straight as possible all the way down the gun. Okay? So that's how we could visually inspect it. The next thing I want to talk about is the recoil assembly, though. Okay, so the recoil assembly, there's so much debate out there when it comes to this, about spring rates and all this other stuff. So I'm not going to talk too much about that But I do want to talk about getting your recoil spring sit-in correct. So believe it or not, a lot of times I see people not understand the difference between the two notches that are on our barrel, right? We have a one notch and then we have the other notch. And basically what happens is you put it on the first notch for assembly. And then when you rack the slide, it drops down to the second, okay? So we never want to install that wrong on the second one from the beginning, okay? We want to put it on the top when it's in assembly mode. When we look at this recoil spring, and before I assemble, once I have the frame assembled, I'll take the recoil spring and I'll make sure that it's not getting stuck on anything. Okay, this is just like a best practice, okay, and I'm pretty good. It doesn't take much to get one of these little coils hung up on something and, you know, just cause you a nightmare when it comes to ejection. Now, with recoil assembly springs also, we have, well, hey, so when do I change them? Why do I change them? And all this other stuff, okay? And again, we cannot apply Glock knowledge here when we're talking about recoil springs. We have to apply Polymer 80 knowledge, okay? The reality is that all of these slides that are coming out for the Polymer 80 are fantastic, but they're all a little bit different. They all have different weights to them. Okay, they're all, manufactured to the tolerances of a Gen 3 Glock, but the reality is that they're all going to play very different for two reasons, okay? The first reason they're going to play different is based on what you are putting with it, okay? So do I have an optic on it? Am I running comps on the front? What are my window cuts? What are my serrations? All of these things are going to play into the overall weight. Now, there's a lot of information out there that says, hey, you don't ever have to change your OEM spring, even if you put an optic on, because the window cuts and the serration and the metal they took away is going to compensate for the weight of your optic. My friends, that's just false. Plain and simple. It's just false. And because the truth of the matter is that a lot of the times we're taking away the weight from where? From the front, right? Got these fancy window cuts, got all this stuff. And where are you adding the weight? In the back. Okay? So the distribution, maybe the overall weight is the same, but the distribution of that weight is very different. Okay, I'm going to do a whole video on that to show you how to check that and how to make sure. But pretty much the rule of thumb is this, okay, when it comes to do I need to change my spring rate when it comes to an OEM spring, okay? The first is you'll hear you don't ever have to change the spring rate because Glock, tests thousands and thousands of rounds and they'll know that it doesn't have to be changed. And the truth is that, again, we can't apply Glock knowledge to Polymer 80 because the reality is that we are, for the most part, a lot of us are running optics on our slide. And we have fancy slides, right? Well, guess what? Back in Gen 3, there was no MOS system. So they're using a single coil spring, okay? When they moved to Gen 4, they moved to dual. Correct? So we can't just say this spring, this OEM spring from Glock Gen 3 has never been tested for use with an optic because they didn't make it then, okay? We take away all the weight. Hey, this is another thing that they're not testing for. Glock's not out there saying, hey, listen, I'm going to test our recoil springs for what the aftermarket slides would be. They don't care about that. They're testing the springs under their weight and their dimensions only. And in the world of the Polymer 80, one of the most beautiful things about our Polymer 80 community is that what? Is almost everyone we see is a little different. They're very unique. They're not all the same. And so we can't just apply that logic. Now, again, am I saying go out and change your spring rate? I am absolutely positively not saying that. But this is what I am saying. Things will play into ejection for you, okay? Things like a comp, things like an optic, things like, am I running a can at the end? All of these things will affect potentially the spring rate that you need in your recoil spring assembly. So here's kind of the rule of thumb. You put your weapon together normal. Okay, you put your weapon together without all the fancy stuff, and you fire it. And if it works, great, great. Once you start adding stuff on, if you start to now have an ejection issue, well, this is how you know it's your recoil spring, right? Because it works fine without it. And the opposite is true. If you've already assembled everything, put your optic on, you put some type of suppressor on, or you put a comp on, and you go out to the range, you start having all these ejection issues, well, then what you do is you start pulling things off, okay? And seeing back down to a regular strip slide with just normal sights and see if you are having that ejection issue. And if you're not, then you know it's because of distribution of weight, and you're going to then have to start to play with changing your recoil spring. Now, I will say this along with that. You don't want to change your recoil spring rate up front. In other words, when I'm doing my build and I'm like, okay, hey, listen, I'm going to go to this pound spring, because you can actually cause a lot of ejection issues if you do not have the right spring rate. Okay. So you start with OEM and you go from there. All right. So that's diagnosing that. So first of all, it's got to come in here nice and good. And second of all, it's got to match with whatever customization you have to your slide and to your weapon. All right, so that's recoil assembly. So let's talk about some of the slide stuff. My friends, there's just so many different slides out there, and while they're all made to fit the Gen 3 tolerances, what I want you to understand is that they're all a little bit different. A lot of them come with different size roofs, right? These hoods here, these hoods are different between where the hood comes up and the top of the frame is. That happens a lot. Well, that's going to affect what? Because what's coming out of there? The casing. Okay, so you want to start to look at some of that stuff too. If you're having an ejection issue, you want to strip down the slide and you want to start to see, am I hitting the roof here at all? Am I hitting the side? This is a good way to tell whether it's actually the slide, because again, you could be changing all this stuff and then still have an ejection issue, and the whole time it's because the slide was milled improperly. So that's basically how we kind of want to tackle the logic, right? Build quality, recoil spring, then our recoil spring assembly mixed with whatever components we have with our fancy slide, and then we want to actually take at the very end, if we haven't been able to solve any of that stuff, strip everything down and look in here. Now, when you do this, I just want to bring something to your attention. Typically, when we clean a slide, so this would be like if you got an ejection issue, you hadn't had one, it was fine, and now all of a sudden you're developing one, right? It's getting sick. If you're all of a sudden developing one, it's either this, because this is going to be the first part you ever need to replace in your Glock. This spring wears out before anything else, okay? It's like changing the oil in your car. Every couple of thousand rounds, it's a good idea to just change that out, okay? I always bring a couple with me whenever I go to the range. They're very, very cheap to have anyway. I throw them in my bag and I got them. But if I change that out and I'm still having an ejection issue, a really big spot that gets extremely disgusting when you're firing a weapon is in here. And a lot of times when folks are cleaning their gun, they don't disassemble all this, right? I mean, they come in here with the brush, they scrub, they clean, use their little CLP, do their oil, and they're back in business. But this area right here is heavily filled with gunk, and I'll tell you, if you've fired your polymer 80, I would even say, hey, listen, take this out and take a look in there. You're going to see what I'm talking about. This is just like a collection place of dirt. So if you're firing and all of a sudden you start to, this weapon is run fine, and now I'm having an ejection issue, well, it might not be the spring. It could be, but it might not be. And if you take this apart and you see it's all filled with gunk, that's most likely what it is. We need to talk about weight, because weight is everything. And in the world of pistols and firearms and gunsmithing, ounces mean everything. And in the world of ejection, the same thing is true. Ounces mean everything. And what we have to understand, again, we're applying polymer 80 logic to everything that we do, not Glock logic. Polymer 80 logic, everybody's using different setups, okay? So it's going to be different for everybody, all right? But I want to just kind of show and illustrate something. We have a standard aftermarket barrel, that's crowned, all right, with an OEM spring. And if we put those on, we can see that the total weight here is 3.7 ounces. Now I want you to remember again, every ounce is major when we're talking about ejection, okay? So now I'm gonna do the same manufacturers at Very Precision, but with a threaded barrel, and same pound spring rate, okay, but just an aftermarket solid, 4.7. That's a whole ounce in just these two pieces, okay? Actually 4.8. And the same thing is true when we get to slides. You know, once we start getting cuts and windows, these slides are all gonna weigh different. Okay, they're all going to weigh different, and then that's going to also come in with whatever type of barrel or spring that we're using. And so last but not least, let's talk about, well, how do I check things, okay? And so if you have your slide on, okay, this obviously has to go back nice and smooth. You have to have really good action. And this, if it's not having perfect action, is going to cause what? It's going to cause some type of ejection issue, right? Because it's not going through the whole motion. And so how do I know if I'm getting, you know, really good action here? Well, number one, we can feel it, okay? But number two, and this is actually just some self-diagnose for you folks that, you know, first assembling your little sticky also, is what you want to do is take a red dry erase marker. Okay, a red dry erase marker, and you can start to color these areas in, right? I can kind of color in where my firing pin is. I can color in along here, on here. I can color in all back here, right? It's a red dry erase. It just wipes off. I can put it on, rack the slide a couple times, take it off, and I'm going to see where my wear spots are. Maybe I'm too high somewhere. Where am I rubbing? Okay, that's not creating a nice smooth action. So this gives you an exact idea right away visually of where your problem exists. And I see a lot of folks that have trigger problems, and they really are like, well, I don't know exactly what it is. I'm telling you, my friends, just color that in, you know, red dry erase marker, put this on, and you'll see exactly how that striker is hitting the top of that sear. Okay, and you'll see exactly how that moves forward, how it's striking forward, and you'll be on your path. Same thing with the rear rails. We have a lot of people that have issues with them. You know, color them in. Again, I'll do another plug. If you're part of my Polymer 80 Masters group, I show you how to check that even before you put this in, okay? But the reality is you can color that in with the red dry erase marker, put it in, and you can kind of start to see where I'm rubbing a little too much or if I'm a little too high, all right? All right, my friends, that's it. That is ejection, perfect ejection, beautiful ejection, first time quality ejection.